Well, good afternoon, everybody. Appreciate the opportunity to be able to speak with everybody in the Flinn-Brown Fellows Network, as well as being able to present the CivEx, education seminar on exploring Arizona's defense ecosystem. But before we get started, I want to give an opportunity to the other Flinn-Brown Fellows who will be presenting with me as well to introduce themselves. And I'd like to start with Alanna.
Hi, I'm Alanna Riggs. I am an executive liaison to our commanding general at Fort Huachuca in Cochise County, the far southeastern corner of the state.
I'm Matt Walsh. I'm with Alanna Riggs, right next door, and same place, same job.
And I'm Travis Schulte, legislative liaison and tribal liaison for the Arizona Department of Emergency and Military Affairs, which is the administrative organization for the Arizona National Guard. Down here hanging out with my other fellows.
And I am Drew Trojanowski, Assistant Vice President for Strategic Initiatives within the Knowledge Enterprise. And the perch that I had previous to this, I worked both for the Chairman of the Armed Services Committee, Senator McCain, managing all the parochial interests from the state in the National Defense Authorization Act, as well as in the White House, focused on kind of defense ecosystems and really the overall mission that we had, responsible both domestic and the National Security Council and the Office of Science and Technology Policy. And so the perks I've had is giving me where Arizona is in the rank order with other states. So for us, the things that we want to cover today is just a background and really kind of big picture on what the infrastructure and industry is in Arizona that supports defense. A comparison to what other states are doing and whether they're succeeding or not, opportunities for growth here in Arizona, and then follow on next steps and ways for other Flinn Fellows to engage. So for the background, I just want to kind of hit on something which I think is a pretty big bumper sticker, which is the defense industry in Arizona. If you add both the installation and industry, there's nearly 300,000 jobs, is nearly $17.5 billion worth of earned income in the state, has a $62 billion impact to the state of Arizona, and the state collects nearly $2 billion worth of taxes from both installations and the industry broadly. And so if you break that apart, you've got roughly $12 billion in defense specifically, and then $50 billion in industry, which, if you add all this together, is about 10% of all jobs in Arizona and about 11% of all earned income in Arizona. And what's fascinating about all of this is most of this happens without any strategic guidance, vision, or leadership in the state. Oh, sorry. But before we get into breaking all of those pieces down, I really wanted to kind of dispel three different segments that often get lumped in together. So in Arizona, we have Arizona Department of Veteran Affairs, and you have to think of these as service members who have gotten out of the military in some form or another. There is a federal agency responsible for coordinating with the state of Arizona. There's roughly 600,000 veterans in Arizona, but ultimately it's a separate organization than what is considered broadly the National Guard, or referred to as the Department of Emergency and Military Affairs, DEMA, which is a cabinet level position that reports to the governor of Arizona, and then it's led by the adjutant general, which is an organization that Travis is representing. And then there's the Department of Defense federally in the state, which we're going to go through all the installations. And then here in Arizona, there is a policy advisor for military and public safety. But this policy advisor focuses principally on state-related activities. So DEMA, Department of Veteran Services, DHS, things like that. And so there is no policy advisor charged with kind of understanding the difference and impact of the federal installations and the broader overall economic impact of industry in the state. So the defense, let's see if I can move this, I apologize. The defense footprint in Arizona is $12 billion. So that amounts to, almost 80,000 jobs, almost $4 billion worth of earned income in the state, $12 billion of economic impact, and then pay roughly, $300 million worth of taxes to the state. It's principally 10 major installations in the state, going from left to right. You have, I don't know if anyone can see my mouse, but you have Marine Corps Air Station Yuma, you have Yuma Proving Ground, then you have Fort Huachuca down south, Davis-Monthan in Tucson, the Air National Guard in Tucson, Silver Bell helicopter port, which is in Marana, You have the National Guard that's at Phoenix International. You've got Papago, which is the Army National Guard, Luke Air Force Base, and Naval Observatory up north. So Fort Huachuca, and just to be really broad so everybody understands what these are, is an Army installation focused on training and testing. And they are geographically isolated in southern Arizona and a very unique space where they are the ones who are conducting a lot of the electronic, communication, electronic warfare systems. Is principally what they're doing down south. Yuma Proving Ground is another Army installation. And I skipped on the last one, how many people are there? And again, so roughly there's 21,000 people that are employed in some form or another in relation to Fort Huachuca, and it has an annual impact of nearly $3 billion. So for Yuma Proving Ground, roughly 8,000 employees and $1.2 billion of economic impact. And really you have to think about what they do is test equipment. So people bring things to them. They want to see if they can survive in the desert. They also own two other training or testing installations. One is jungle, one is Arctic. And so they send things between all those to see what the overall impact is going to be of those equipment and whether or not they can field them. Luke Air Force Base is the principal F-16 and F-35 training installation for the Air Force. 15,000 employees, $2.5 billion worth of economic impact. The thing that's the most important about Luke Air Force Base is that it operationally controls what is called Buried Goldwater Range, or BMGR, which is an enormous piece of training installation where it has no fly over the top of it, and it is a principal place where a lot of missions come to test, train, and do operational environment. Marine Corps Air Station Yuma, MCAS Yuma, employs roughly 78,000 and has nearly $1 billion of economic impact. And this is also the premier training site for the Marines for all F-35 pilots. But they also have things down there like the Ospreys, that MV-22, and Harriers as well. Davis-Monthan Air Force Base is in Tucson. It's an Air Force installation that has, give or take 17,000 employees and a $2.6 billion economic impact. And principally, it has A-10 squadrons, combat search and rescue. In that picture, you see these EC-130s that do electronic warfare. So it's an operational installation. So they train and they forward deploy regularly. And then the Department of Emergency Management, roughly 8,000 employees, $1.2 billion of economic impact, but you have a handful of installations all across the state, units all over the state. The Army National Guard headquarters is by Papago, which is in central Phoenix. You've got the Western Aviation National Guard training site, which is the Watts, which is a heliport where they train. A lot of different units have rotated in through there. There was AH-64 Apaches, there was UH-60 Blackhawks, there was Kiowas, a lot of different things down there. Tucson International Airport is the premier F-16 training pilot unit that has more than 70 F-16s. And then you have the air refueling wing that's at the Phoenix International Airport, which is the Strata tanker that you see at the bottom there. So, adding to that, so we just walked through all the installations in the state. And then if you combine that with what the defense manufacturing is in the state, the defense industry, if you will, is nearly $52 billion worth of economic impact. You've got 1,200 companies that are in the supply chain base, and you have to think this is things, the big primes like Boeing or Raytheon. Raytheon is almost $8 billion annually in Arizona. Boeing is $3 billion. Honeywell's $1 billion. Northrop is nearly $1 billion. General Dynamics is almost $1 billion. So all of these things and all of this, ends up amalgamating to roughly, 216,000 jobs in Arizona, $13.6 billion worth of earned income in the state, economic impact of $51 billion, and pays nearly $1.5 billion worth of taxes in the state. And so just circling back to all of these things combined with each other, the economic impact is fairly substantial in Arizona. And, for whatever reason, it has been something that's historically, underappreciated, just overlooked, if you will, because of the units typically being geographically isolated in areas that people don't want to go. That's one of the reasons they are where they are. The DoD broadly purchases real estate where people aren't because it's available to them and they can keep people from looking in. And so most people are disconnected from all the activity that goes on, but they're an enormous supplier of not only jobs, but then also the local supply base surrounding them. And this is a substantial, valuable industry in the state, and should be something that is managed and has a strategic vision. And again, just to hit these numbers again, because they're fairly substantive, you have 293,000, almost 300,000 jobs in Arizona are in this industry, $17 billion worth of economic or of earned income, $62 billion of economic impact, and 1.79 or $2 billion worth of taxes paid in the state. So while this is an enormous economic impact for Arizona, there are threats that exist to the overall infrastructure. So there's something that's called a base realignment and closure. These are typically things that happen nearly, like the first one started in 1988 and the last one was in 2005. But you have to think this is good governance in a lot of ways, where the DoD is thinking about how it can align missions based on where they're being used, or their old buildings they can shutter and they can move staff around. This is, it's just a way for them to consolidate their resources in a meaningful way. But that also means that whenever they do those things, that people will move jobs, people will lose jobs, economic impact will substantially change. And so the last one was done in 2005, 23 different bases closes and 2,500 bases were realigned. I mean, it is substantive, right? They proposed another one in 2016 and Senator McCain, thwarted that. So in response, what typically happens at this point is other states will look to missions and figure out how can we reprogram those, or how can we get those to come to our state. And this is a constant and pervasive activity. Other states like Alabama, other states like Nevada, they have either the political capital to figure out how to pull new mission in, or they have the ear of the service trying to figure out how to move them into their state. But I'll pause there, and Matt, anyone else who has contributed on?
Yeah, thanks, Drew. Yeah, just to put a punctuation mark on that, and it looks like a nice little bullet on the slide, but it's real to the state of Arizona and to the installations, those of us that live and operate out here. So in the last 20 years, there have been two attempts, one by the state of Maryland and one by the state of Alabama most recently, to move missions that are done here predominantly in Southeast Arizona at Fort Huachuca back to their respective states. And in most cases, in the case of the testing mission that was trying to be moved back to Maryland, Senator McCain was able to step in at the time because it was during his tenure, and he wrote legislation that required, let's call it good governance in the process, to bring a level playing field. So it didn't become a political football. It brought some rigor to it. But without Senator McCain there, we could have lost that mission to the state of Maryland. Not because it would have been better done there, but because they had a better delegation. They were organized, and they're close to the nation's capital, and they spend a lot of time lobbying in the halls of Congress. So that's kind of the longer one. The most recent one is Senator Shelby from Alabama has been trying to move the unmanned aircraft training mission from Fort Huachuca back into Fort Rucker, Alabama. This has been ongoing. This has all happened after Senator McCain retired or relinquished his seat, and it has been a bit of a different uphill slog with that. But these things go on. These things happen, mostly outside the press. And Drew is spot on. There's actual. It's not a word on a slide. It's not a boogeyman in the room. It happens all the time.
And yeah, it doesn't affect just the active component. The Arizona National Guard has been impacted as well back in 2012, and we'll get to a slide later that talks about it, but yeah, it's up now. The Army introduced this aviation restructuring initiative, ARI. So launched in 2012, really, and the states were only informed about it in probably the beginning of 2013, but what it essentially did, it proposed to divest the Apache helicopter from the National Guard to the active component. And there were states behind this initiative. So the first domino to fall was in Arizona, where we used to train the Apache there at the Watts, the Western Army Aviation Training Site. And so that mission flew away in 2013, and it flew back to Alabama. They poached that training site to consolidate all the training and thus the economic impact to that state. And then gradually other states like New York was trying to get a piece of the Apaches as well. we were able to delay that action and have a reconsideration by forcing the National Commission on the Future of the Army, in which they split the baby and allowed 4 states to retain the mission, 4 National Guard states. But Arizona did lose that. We lost our Apache unit by these mission realignment activities, which has the same effect as a BRAC.
And to put a finer point on what Travis is saying is, when the Apache unit was moved out of Arizona, that's, almost 1,000 jobs. That's hundreds of millions of dollars of economic impact, right? That's just one singular unit of 4 helicopters. And then you've got the A-10s are trying to be reprogrammed, right? They're trying to move those. The Air Force is making a compelling case that they should go back to Nevada. Well, if you hollow out this operational mission that's in Arizona, what backfills it? And if that's not being advocated for, then you open up the conversation of, well, why do we need to have Davis-Monthan? And so we have organizations, they're called community support organizations. So some exist within, just outside the fence line of the installation. We have industry councils because they give a voice to the installations who are unable to lobby Congress. They can, tell our local communities what's going on, how to advocate on behalf of the mission locally. But the problem is most of these things were stood up after the 2005 BRAC, and they were really good at being guard dogs of making sure that we didn't lose mission then as a result of BRAC. But now the insidiousness of the way that missions are being reprogrammed, it is being done much further than an announcement of a BRAC. It is, being done years in advance, where this is being worked into a budgetary process. It's being put through, you don't want to call it academic rigor, but let's call it service level rigor, where they produce reports about why they need to reprogram, and that needs to be maintenance and watched, and make sure that you have an opportunity to thwart it before you get to, hey, we've made this decision, and then the community has to respond in a fire drill effect, and you're trying to slam the brakes on something that has an enormous amount of momentum, and it's always hard to do that. So, comparison to what other states are doing. Texas, there's a lot of words here, but really what it has to, you boil it down to, is they were threatened with a BRAC, and in 2005, they stood up an organization they call the Texas Military Preparedness Commission. Innocuous as it may be, they have roughly $250 million of rolling fund that they can use to attract and retain military missions in their state. So they, invest in infrastructure, or they, put IT in, whatever it might be that is needed to increase attractiveness for mission. And that has led them not only to retain their mission. When we talk about Arizona having a large economic impact, because we had $12 billion of federal installation in our state, Texas has $150 billion worth of federal installation in their state. It's just a different type of game, and they've been at this for 20 years. So much so that in the last couple of years, they were able to get Army Futures Command to relocate to Austin, Texas. That's, was a statewide effort of the entire Texas school system, the state of Texas, the city of Austin, and it was the first time a 4-star command was set up in the last half of a century. And they put all of this in Austin, which followed with it, an $11 billion, which is equivalent to what we completely do in our state, of just investment of science and technology annually. And so that then led VC to follow. So then you have this migration of a lot of things that leave Silicon Valley. So there is an economic engine to be had here. And when you think about some of the opportunity, where if with some leadership, with some alignment across the state, there's a focus, there's an opportunity for an enormous amount of growth. Additionally, I just wanted to highlight Indiana. Indiana also suffered a BRAC in 2005. It was a facility they had called Navy Cranes, where they do a lot of the front-end research around microelectronics and things like that for the Navy. And this is just outside of Purdue. Well, when they got realigned, they were created with some funds that they had available to them. They invested that in a tech park, which then led them to, create effectively what is the Office of Defense Development. So they could think through that further. And it just began to steamroll, where then they have this regional opportunities incentive and a master plan tech park. And now this is, just outside the fence line. It's shared between multiple universities, the federal footprint, and they're just spitting out technology constantly. There's 573 inventions that came out in the last couple of years alone. So it's impressive when there's alignment to focus on the germination coming from the federal enterprise, and then the community following with the investment. And that's what we want to talk through, is the opportunity for growth in Arizona. So, there's two things that are happening right now that are impacting DoD broadly that Arizona can take advantage of. So the shift is happening from what was typically, the CENTCOM Middle East theater, where that's where we spent, the Iraq campaign, Afghanistan campaign, and there's a shift to the Pacific for a lot more reasons than one. But that is a benefit to Arizona, because the only way to train like we fight is that Arizona is geographically positioned to support with the copious amount of range space that we have available. And then on top of that, DoD has to modernize. When our proverbial threat being China, the modernization effort, it is profound what happens in China. They spent $1.5 trillion on defense modernization last year. If they fail at 99%, they still beat us. It's kind of wild. They are transitioning technology 5 times faster than anyone else in the world. It is a lot. So the federal enterprise has made a decision that we need to figure out how to get non-traditional actors together to focus on how we modernize, like a World War II, whole of government effort. But I'll pause there. Matt, Travis, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I'd say, to kind of put it in another statement, or try to add some clarity to it to bring it to ground. We're going through the largest change in the U.S. military's history, probably since the end of the Cold War, of which we think about it, the wall came down in 1991. So it's been over 30 years ago. We've spent the last 20 years becoming, we, the Army, I'm speaking for the Army piece of this, the best manhunters in the world. You find somebody in a battle space, we could find that individual, locate them, and take them out, capture them, whatever we needed to do. And we became really good at that. And then the world changed. 2014, and it actually goes back prior to that with the Russians and their aggression in Georgia, and then in the Crimea. And so now what we're watching today is kind of the nascent start of another potential large ground combat conflict on a spectrum that we haven't seen since World War II, as Drew said, in the plain. And most people don't realize we have 2 combat divisions sitting in 2 of those Eastern European countries, sitting there bolstering. So if Russia crosses over, or something gets out of hand and it spills over from Belarus into Lithuania or anything else, we have to be prepared as part of NATO to respond to that. And we have spent 20 years atrophying being manhunters, and we're now trying to shift. China and the Pacific, think of Russia and Europe. The challenges that we face there are fundamentally different than what we've been good at doing for the last 20 years. And so we are going through a sea change of technology and everything else. And you want to add into that, Travis?
No, I just kind of add in that the National Guard, as part of the U.S. Armed Forces, as the state's component of the U.S. Armed Forces, is changing as well. And it went from a strategic reserve prior to the attacks, the terrorist attacks on September 11, 2001, to an operational reserve. And it is regularly in the fight. Arizona is regularly in the fight, and it actively contributes to the training and operational cadence of the U.S. Armed Forces here in Arizona as well as abroad. So the cultural shift is across the active and reserve components.
Yeah, Drew, in essence, time will turn it back over to you, but that's probably how we could kind of put a little bumper sticker or something more tangible over.
Copy. So for everybody to think about too in context, so ultimately, what does that mean? So if our fight is shifting, we always, as a service, as a military, we train, and we train like we're going to fight, and so that we have to think through it. What does that look like? Well, most people don't realize this, but the standoff distance for the F-35, I mean, the weapon systems are so advanced that the space between where they can fire at something and where they start their engagement, they start in Texas and they fire in New Mexico, hitting targets in Arizona. So the West is in a really unique area for us to be able to test both the technological advancements that we have and then train like the future fight is going to be. So we're able to integrate together all these different component parts across multiple states. but the only place that you have access to this amount of space is from Texas west out of the Pacific Ocean. And so part of the reshaping that's going on within the department broadly is thinking about, how we create an integrated, networked series of installations and ranges, because it's going to be too difficult to invest all the infrastructure needed to build them up. But maybe we have all these 50 years worth of investments that we can leverage as needed, so that we can begin to really create a more comprehensive training environment that will look like what we presume the future fight will be. And again, Arizona is in a very unique position because we have so much range space available to us, and there are no flight patterns over where we have these very unique areas. But I'll pause there. Matt, Travis, any thoughts on?
No, it's it's spot on, Drew, and it's again for those of us that are students of the military side of this thing. It is absolutely critical. Today we are playing out on the joint service side this thing called Project Convergence, which is literally, as Drew said, we are knitting together operations at Kirkland Air Force Base and White Sands Missile Range in New Mexico, with Fort Huachuca going all the way around to Yuma and up into Nevada and Southern California to get after this tyranny of distance. If you start laying out the coast of China and the South China Sea, and if anybody's familiar with the Spratly Islands and all these atolls that the Chinese are building these military installations on to try to give us area access, area denial, try to keep us out of threatening their homeland. We have to be able to figure out, if we had to go to war with them over Taiwan, which is a scary proposition, we have to be able to figure out how to penetrate that kind of time and distance with the systems we have today, or the new capabilities we need in the future. We need places to be able to test and train those new systems. And it literally is a whole of the Southwest US problem, and that only dents a small part of an overlay over a South China Sea battle type scenario.
Yeah, a fun little factoid. One of the things I thought was crazy, and a lot of these things aren't really talked about, but between 2010 and 2018, China built up its island defense system. Essentially, they created 350 million new acres of real estate so that you couldn't penetrate into the island chain. I mean, that's almost the size of Arizona worth of new real estate that was just created as a coral reef to keep out naval ships. So that's why these ranges become important, because standoff is how most of the future conflict is going to occur. But that said, Arizona is extremely well positioned, as the last slide I was talking about, in terms of being able to support what the future fight is, right? So when the department is thinking through, where are we going to place future mission? Where are we going to have new squadrons of aircraft? Where are we going to have these new things? The fact that it's going to be Western centric allows us as a state to get over the tyranny of distance, because, as Matt brought up earlier, folks like Maryland and all these states that are close to the Beltway are able to spend a lot of their free time there chattering in the ear of legislators who are making decisions, or in the Pentagon for those who are making decisions. The fact that the geographic requirement is going to be a benefit to us. There's no other place to put it other than in the West. The other thing that's of great interest to us is where we have an opportunity to do industry alignment. Think about most of the things that had been previously done by the military, right? It's not like, as a commercial industry, we're overly interested as a state in future battleships or the tanks that are being built. There's not a lot of commercial application, but the modernization that's going on right now in DoD, is like advanced communication systems, right? 5G, 6G, next G, things like that. And then how do you integrate autonomous systems into that, or vehicles, or things like that? Microelectronics, that's an enormous push for the state of Arizona. What are we doing on space, new space? And ultimately there's this interest in trying to figure out, how do we leverage the inversion that's gone on, where if you look at, for the first time in the federal mandates history, the commercial market is outpacing the federal investment in a particular segment. Think about SpaceX, think about Blue Origin. And so there's this overall interest across the federal enterprise, and especially the DoD, to go, hey, we have interest in all these technologies. What has everybody else been up to? Or how do we figure out how to create a front door where there previously wasn't one, for us to get non-traditional innovators or small businesses, or how do we bring more people, because we have to innovate faster in order to keep up. And so Arizona has an opportunity to cultivate an innovation ecosystem that's focused on industries that we're interested in, right? Whether that's microelectronics, whether that's advanced communications, whether that's cyberspace, what it's going to be. Like these are things that we're interested in. So there needs to be a leverage opportunity. One of the ways, as the collective has been working on this, universities partnered together and thought about how they could create an innovation ecosystem that's comprised of the Department of Defense, academia, and industry, which is affectionately dubbed the Mission Acceleration Center. We worked the congressional process and got a $50 million ad this year so that we could establish these things. And it's specifically so that it becomes an easier mechanism by which we can bring academic partners to the table, we can bring small business to the table and convert that knowledge and that workforce into a transition into future segments within the DoD. But again, most of the things that DoD is focused on are commercially viable as well. So how does that then net benefit us as a state? So next steps. Challenges, I just went through opportunities, but challenges are going to be substantive. I've been at this for more than a decade, trying to think through how we would do this. And ultimately, there's a lack of fundamental leadership to establish the vision that Arizona needs. And it's not for any reason other than the fact that if you made a Venn diagram, the circles would never touch each other. The state government is focused on things that the state are focused on, and they make a presumption that the federal enterprise, which is our legislators, are focused on the federal missions. While there is awareness, no one is really responsible for each other. And so there isn't an opportunity for us to create a cohesive, multi-layered vision for what that's going to require. I went through what Texas has done. That's a whole of government effort across the state. Same with Indiana. And so, if we want to talk about how we want to get future ranges into Arizona or future missions into Arizona on our ranges, there's going to have to be someone who's thinking about FCC, someone who's thinking about FAA, someone who's managing these component parts. How is that going to affect state land trust? How's that and then someone has to wrangle the installations in the state. So really all this is going to boil down to the governor. And how do we create this focus on a federal engagement strategy and leverage our place? The other challenge that we have is there are states that have, been there, done that, and they've got a t-shirt, right? They are trying to figure out how to poach missions from us, and they are really good at it. And so in the absence of a vision, it is very easy to figure out how to pick people apart or pick us as a community apart and try to usurp missions from us. They've been succeeding, and we need to not only stop that, but all of those other opportunities, leverage that to grow mission in Arizona. And then ultimately, to the other point, is that DoD wants applied technology. Universities aren't incentivized and their structures aren't aligned to support. And so that's incumbent on, again, a greater vision for how the state creates the innovation ecosystem. I'll pause there. Matt, Travis, you guys want to?
No, I think that's good, Drew. I think it really kind of summarizes the, we have a lot of good, and I'll let you talk to this, but there are some anecdotal things where we are working across academia installations. If you want to talk a little bit about like the low cross threat emitter and how that's working with Fort Huachuca and Barium Goldwater Range, or I can talk to that. But they are happening, but systemically, strategically, it's not happening. And Drew's spot on, and we are missing opportunities. And then kind of going back to the proactive reactive thing, we can wait for these things to pop up and then try to go run out there and get involved, or better off. And that's kind of the bad lesson learned from Travis, that Travis shared about the Guard, was they were already a year into the decision process when Arizona even found out that they were being looked at to lose their Apache mission. Or we can become those kind of smart people that are out there involved, plugged in, and are communicating a message, have a vision, and know how our assets here come together to provide a unique capability that DoD is really looking for to get after some of these technology and other gaps and problems. And I'll turn it back over to you, Drew, if you want to hit anything else, or Travis, anything?
No, I think that hits upon it. I can speak from a personal standpoint with DEMA. When we do engage with our federal delegation, we try to advocate for the entire state. We reiterate the priorities from Fort Huachuca, from Davis Moth, and from Luke, like basically all those installations that can't necessarily advocate for themselves. We try to carry that message, but there's just so much bandwidth to do, and frankly, we're focused on the military mission. And we're hyper focused now, having learned our lesson from 2013. But we just cannot get to like the industry piece, and so the industry piece is another vital aspect where there's room for growth that will benefit the state, and there just needs to be more players involved.
Absolutely. It's, Matt, Alanna represent principals, Travis represents a principal. Like there are folks to report to, and the problem is, the day-to-day operations that each one of the installations has is consuming. I mean, there's more than enough work to go around. So it's hard to take a step back and have a strategic vision for what the state should be, or what the region should be, or how. So someone has to be charged and tasked with that. So call to action, recommendations, next steps. There is something that exists within our state government called the Military Affairs Commission. Our proposal collectively, or at least for me, it would be that it needs to be rechartered, refocused, expanded, and expand membership and fund it. And I say that, like its charter right now is thinking principally about encroachment. So, hey, those F-35s, freedom is great and all, but they're really loud. Someone needs to change where their flight path is because I need to sleep at night. And so the Military Affairs Commission is trying to figure out how can we create lanes and vectors for where their afterburners come on, or how they're not thinking about a strategic vision for how Arizona grows mission, right? They're thinking about how to do state land trust swaps so we can get additional real estate so that we can create a perimeter around the installation so that no one is bothered and they don't complain about the installation doing what the installation does, as opposed to this being this, collective impact in a community. And ultimately, it's tough to compete with something like Texas, but a $250 million annual a year revolving fund to protect and grow mission is something to be envious of. It'd be great to start somewhere, at least to charter someone with a task force to create a strategic vision for where we can go, to take that off the plates of the installation, someone to sit down and say, what does that look like? Another thing that would be of great benefit would be establishing a new state level advisor specifically focused on the congressional executive process. And again, the point being is the advisor that currently exists is principally going to be focused on, the interplay between DEMA and state agencies, DHS, what's happening on the border. There's a law enforcement focus and like kind of a posture to it. It just is how it's been for a long time. And again, because there's more than enough work to go around with this one particular segment, but the amount of impact in the state for the federal footprint and missions, to me, warrants having someone who's focused on this day-to-day full time and isn't being distracted by all of the other things that are happening in the state on a regular basis. I'd additionally offer that at the beginning, we talked through some of the community support organizations. There's both industry who focus on, opportunities for workforce development, technology and industries of the future, how we attract some of that. They're working with ACA, they're working with GPEC, the other economic development consortiums around the state. But there's also the community support organizations like the Southern Arizona Defense Alliance or the Fighter Country Partnership, wherever they may be, and ultimately getting involved in those organizations to add an additional voice to it so that they really understand that there's an opportunity here. And then again, getting involved with the Mission Acceleration Center in some form or another, which is intended to be this amalgamation of, defense, industry, and academia, spitting out solutions to problems that have been challenging DoD. But I'll pause there. Other panelists?
Yeah, the only thing I would add to the slide here, and this is probably something that we could do internal to ourselves, and I know Don's on there listening, so I'll go out on a limb here. But I'd love to see the ongoing discussion, because Drew's trying really valiantly to cover, and I'm sure this is probably overwhelming if you're not in our little ecosphere that Drew and I and Travis and Alanna, a lot of us live in. It probably seems, it's kind of like how I feel when somebody starts talking about K through 12 education in Arizona, even though I think it's probably a little easier. It just seems a little overwhelming. But I would love to see, since I've been a member of the fellowship since 2013, I'd love to see Flinn-Brown dedicate 4 hours of one of these sessions on a recurring basis where Drew doesn't have to talk staccato fire like a carny, I think was how he worded. He was going to go through. I told him he'd never get through 30 slides, but to be able to have a little more in-depth discussion and explore this a little more, because the economic impacts and benefits to the state are immense potentially. The visibility, even in an organization like ours, is almost non-existent. And we got to start with some visibility and discussion someplace. And I would love to see Flinn-Brown, kind of like they were back a while ago with the biotech, as Drew talked about a little bit about microelectronics. I know there's some other discussions about bringing green energy industry into Arizona, opening up some chip manufacturing capabilities from Taiwan. This is an opportunity or an area that is untapped, unfocused, and is going to go unattended, and we are missing out. And so even if we just at Flinn-Brown purpose to learn more, so we could then go out and become emissaries to other people in our communities, because the bases aren't, we do kind of a terrible job of opening up our doors. We try to, but I think there's a lot of people who are just kind of intimidated when they hear about the military installation. Nobody wants, oh, well, you know, that's Fort Huachuca. They do all that intelligence stuff. You know, we'd have to kill you if we told you, and that's not true. It's, you know, it's more bluff and bluster, and it's, so I would love to see that as maybe an additional, is that we can devote more time to the subject in the Civic Leadership Academy and advances, because it's going to take some time.
And I think, yeah, from a policy, like learning standpoint, I think the community and certainly Flinn-Brown Fellows would be fascinated by how much military policy and state policy can really intersect. And it goes very deep, it's very broad, and it'd just be fascinating to explore further with the teams.
Yeah.
All right, about wraps us up. I saw that Jennifer shot a note out for questions.
Yeah, so you've got a question, or not a question, but a statement in the chat from Dr. Severson, who says she's the president of Bush Techs Incorporated, Satellite Communications in Gilbert. She says they do a lot of federal jobs in the space and U of A industries, and she is a Flinn-Brown Fellow. She said she'd love to hear more and learn more about how she can be involved in a state level.
Sure, and I see the email there. I will send a follow-up note. But ultimately, there's a place that I would plug you into, which, based on where you're at, the Mesa Industry and Defense Council, aside from its name being Mesa, they cover the entire East Valley and a lot of the state. This organization was stood up in, I want to say 2016, to support, you know, Senator McCain's efforts when he was chairman of the Armed Services Committee to figure out how we could connect some of these component pieces together. How can we grow defense industry? And ultimately, how do you advocate? As, you know, members of Congress, I was a person who sat in DC and got the deluge of interests, wants, requests, desires, asks for money, all of the above from everywhere in the state, and try to figure out if it made sense to put in a defense bill. And so what it was a consolidation of voices to, you know, prioritize those things that are most important and have an impact on the state. That would be greatly informed if there was a vision for the state to know what particular things that ACA should be going to cold call companies to see if they should relocate. We should be going to DoD to figure out if we can bring these things back in. So I would say at a bare minimum, I can follow up offline and talk about kind of what that looks like, but connect you with Mesa Industry and Defense Council.
So another question, do you believe the spaceport concept for Southwest Arizona will be a reality? Super
blunt, no. It's not going to happen because there's a challenge on the horizontal launch. And so there's other states who are pushing this. There's an opportunity for us to play enormously with Space Force, with it, like the AFRLV is coming, knocking on our door, NASA as well, but I don't know that we're going to be a launch site. I think that we will be a supply side and the new space technology side, but that's my opinion. Anyone else can chime in.
All right, we don't have any additional questions in the Q&A unless somebody wants to type in something more.
It was just that bewildering, that amazing.
Wow, Drew, I would have said you would have never gotten through all those slides in 46 minutes. Just to talk a little bit about something, and if there's some more questions, if not, then we can wrap up at this point. But I just alluded to a little bit about the partnership between what we do here and what you guys are doing with the low-cost threat emitter. And so, just to show just a small little kind of isolated case how we're working together to do this. So I'll set it up, and then you can chime in at the end on what you guys did with ASU. But part of our mission, and we talked a little bit about the islands and the tyranny of distance and the Pacific theater and everything, and these kind of outward bases, because the Chinese are trying to turn the South China Sea into a Chinese sea, and everybody else has to keep out or pay homage or capital to get in there. And so one of the problems is they are using these outward islands as outpost pickets to put these high-powered radars in to deny our ability to get in there with aircraft or ships or other vehicles. And so one of our challenges in the Army world is being able to replicate these kinds of threat systems, surface-to-air missiles, surface-to-surface missiles, etc., and the radars and things, so we can find them and fix them, and then we can then figure out how do we then want to go out and interdict and attack them. Do we want to shoot something like a missile at it? Do we want to move something in close and then turn on a jammer and effectively blind their eyes for a period of time so we can go in and do stuff? There's a whole lot of conversation right around how are we going to get after this distance and this area denial, area access capability, these advanced capabilities that adversaries have. And so part of our challenge in the intelligence community is we need to be able to develop systems that can find them and fix them from large distances so that we don't put our platforms at risk of being sensed and shot down. And then also developing kind of non-kinetic capabilities to be able to go in via jamming, directed energy, and other sources to be able to disable those until we can then get in and do what we need to do. We're never going to have an army as big as China or a navy as big as China. They got more money and they got more people. And so we have to create these opportunities of what we call strategic overmatch to be able to get in, kind of degrade their capabilities, and then start to degrade their command structure and other things to create an advantage for us, because we're always going to be smaller, but we're going to be more technologically advanced. And so if you would just talk to that, that's been one of our challenges that we're looking at, is we're developing new systems for the Army down here. And then in that process, we ran across Drew with our friends up at Berrien Goldwater at Luke Air Force Base on how you guys created this very cheap. We're not going to be able to go out and buy all these kind of adversary equipment because they aren't going to sell it to us and it's not available, but we can emulate that to a degree that it allows us to have the fidelity to get after the technologies and things that we're going to need to be able to find it, and then hopefully, if we have to take action on it, do that. And I'll turn it over to you, Drew, on how you guys worked with us.
Yeah, keep it at like a very 30,000 foot level, right? What Matt's describing is they needed a capability that looks, if anyone saw Top Gun 2, he was flying through those valleys and there was these missiles that were getting shot at him. We need to replicate those things, those missile sites. How do we do that in a cost-effective way? So that started with a conversation from Luke Air Force Base. They're like, hey, you have smart people. Can you help us make this thing cheap? And we're like, yeah, we probably could. And so just organic request, we sat down with each other and built something, took it out on the range, fired up an F-35, flew it out to New Mexico, brought it back, beep, 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 turns out it works. Beeping and squeaking on the radar. Wow, manna from heaven, look what we just did. And it cost us only a couple K. All right, let's see if we can do more of this, right? So this concept around how do we break defense acquisitions, which has been frozen and slow and bureaucratic? How do we identify needs that we have, and can our community support that? And the more that our community can support that organically, the easier and more compelling it is for us to be able to go look at all of the equity that we have here, look at all the cool new things that we're building here. So for us, effectively, all we did is create, it's called a software-defined radio, right? It is a way that you can create mesh networks. It's effectively a 5G platform that's projecting outward. Well, there's an interest commercially in these things as well, right? So you can start to see where there's an organic request for us to build something. There's a commercial viability, which is why the university's focused on it. They weren't thinking about it in the sense of a defense application, but it has one. And now that we've been able to do this, to Matt's point, Army's interested in it, the Air Force is interested in it, the Marine Corps is interested in it. It's gotten the attention of what's called the Indo-Pacific Theater and the Indo-Pacific Command that's out in Hawaii, trying to figure out how do we amalgamate some of these pieces so that we can do larger training effects and we can scatter these all about so we can train like we fight. And so I saw a question that popped in that was like, how do we do this with the microelectronics and semiconductors? I mean, I think that's like one of the principal problems that DoD has right now is what's your supply chain and where did it get manufactured? And so for us to create more and more advanced technology, we're going to have a pretty good thumbprint on where this thing came from. And if we can organically source things that are made locally, I mean, US specific, but if we're able to create more of this here, the more electronics that we make and have a handle on the component parts that are inside of it is going to create a velocity that allows us to do more and more defense work, right? And so those are the types of things where if you're doing advanced communications, and this is in the RF frequency, which is what Matt and Fort Huachuca specialize in, you're going to want to know how you build it. And we're trying to figure out how to build all those component parts here. So there's a place where they intersect with each other.
Okay,
And well, it doesn't matter. There's a lot of behind the
Go
scenes.
ahead. You can see that one.
Sorry.
Alanna, there's another question in the box from Andrew, and then I think there aren't any more questions after this. We can turn it back over to Dawn. So over to Alanna, the last question.
Yeah. So question is, would this be similar to the Starlink use by DoD to improve communications?
No, it's similar, but I mean, it's hard to break these things out, right? One is a very specific vendor that has a pretty intense network of low Earth orbit satellites, what they call LEO mesh networks. The underlying component of how these things communicate with each other is the same. But what we built organically, because we have the intellectual horsepower, isn't, a productized version of what is in low Earth orbit that is being able to be leveraged by Elon Musk. But ultimately what happens is academia has a lot to offer DoD, but they speak completely different languages and they don't know how to talk to each other. So the things that DoD says, and I'm coming from, I live DoD, I live in academia. DoD says things in DoD gobbledygook, and academia says things in, academic gobbledygook. And while they may have a very direct interface with each other, it's really hard to translate the gobbledygooks. And so when we were able to do the thing that Matt was talking about, is do this, low cost threat emitter with a software defined radio, what it did is create an opportunity for both of us to kind of look inside and go, well, I didn't know you were doing that. Those all could benefit me as well. And I didn't know you needed those things, because the researchers and folks like that need to be informed on what the needs are so they can tailor where they're going with the activities they're doing. And so it's been a boon for us to be able to collaborate with each other like that, which is why the manifestation of that was a physical co-location space that we call the Mission Acceleration Center, that puts DoD personnel, academic personnel, small business, you wrap that around with services, PTAC, procurement, technical assistance, small business assistance, all those things. And so the idea being, let's start to churn things out fairly quickly that support Arizona's ecosystem.
Okay. I don't know, Atlanta, we don't have any more questions. We turn it back over to Dawn. Drew did a great job, man. Awesome. Patting ourselves on the back here, but good job, Drew. Like I said, you'd have never got through all those slides, but you got 5 minutes to spare, brother.
Fast talking Carney.
Thank you all for joining us today, and thank you, Drew, Matt, Travis, and Alanna for the presentation, and thank you to the audience for participating. This will be up on our website, and if anyone in the audience has follow-up questions later, feel free to reach out to the center and we will direct your questions accordingly. Thank you.
Thank you.